Luisa, with her sweet smile and bright eyes, captivated everyone. That was how she won Antonio over at a dinner with friends, where, between conversations about dreams and values, the two fell in love. Their relationship grew stronger, and over time, they got married, moving into the house Luisa had inherited from her parents. The house was more than a home for her. It was a reliquary of memories that connected her roots and family memories. For Antonio, the house represented only the comfort of the present and perhaps future possibilities. Even when Luisa noticed a damp spot and suggested repairs, he didn't pay much attention. For him, it was just a spot. For her, it was essential care for something that symbolized their history. Over time, the spot grew, reflecting the differences that arose between the couple. The situation worsened when a real estate agent offered a high amount for the house. Luisa, attached to her home, didn't consider selling, but Antonio was enthusiastic. For him, the money was an opportunity for new experiences and comfort. For Luisa, the house was irreplaceable, carrying the memories of her parents and her past. The offer caused disagreements between them, and the topic of selling it began to generate tension. Antonio insisted on the financial benefits, while Luisa saw the sale as a loss of part of her soul. This difference in vision created small arguments and distances, making both realize that despite their love, they had different values. The presence of the stain on the ceiling became a symbol of the wear and tear between them, a crack that, even if small, showed how certain conflicts and unshared dreams could compromise what once seemed like perfect harmony. Luisa, on the other hand, remained firm in her desire to preserve the home that meant so much to her. The love between them was still there, but little by little, the differences about what truly mattered in life became more evident. In one of these conversations, Luisa finally spoke from the heart. "Antonio, understand. This house represents the history of my family. Every little piece of it reminds me of my parents, my childhood, everything I love. I can't put a price on that. For me, this house is irreplaceable." She said this with tears in her eyes, hoping he would understand the depth of her feelings. For a moment, Antonio seemed to realize how much that meant to Luisa. He took a deep breath and tried to argue more rationally. "Honey, I understand your connection to this house, but think about the future. This money can give us more freedom, a more comfortable life. We don't have to give up the memories. We can take them with us to a new home." Luisa felt a pang of sadness and a slight disappointment, because his words seemed superficial compared to the meaning the house had for her. "It's not the same, Antonio. These walls hold memories. I can't take that with me somewhere else." Even after their conversation, she felt that her husband still didn't truly understand her. From that moment on, a subtle tension built up between them. The conversation about selling the house began to be avoided, but the issue remained between them, like a shadow that seemed increasingly difficult to ignore. Antonio, despite not bringing up the subject anymore, continued to think about the money, and Luisa knew it. His desire to sell it was still there, even though he tried to hide it. And in the meantime, the stain on the ceiling continued to grow, almost as a symbol of the unresolved feelings that were emerging between them. Luisa wondered where this difference would take them. If this disagreement was just an obstacle to be overcome, or if it represented something deeper. Little by little, she began to realize that perhaps this problem was bigger than she imagined. Over time, the tension between Luisa and Antonio only grew. They both tried to avoid the topic of selling the house, but the silence seemed to be even heavier than the words. Antonio, even without saying it directly, seemed frustrated with Luisa's decision. She, on the other hand, felt hurt, as if her husband did not respect the sentimental value the house had for her. Every day, the two grew a little further apart, and the home that had once been a haven of love and tranquility now harbored a growing discomfort. It was at this delicate moment that a new challenge arose. Antonio's mother, Donna Teresa, had a fall at home and broken her arm. As she was getting older, her recovery required constant care, and Antonio, as an only child, saw no other alternative than to bring her to live with them for a while. When he told Luisa his decision, she tried to smile and appear understanding, but she felt a hint of apprehension. The relationship between Luisa and Dona Teresa had never been the best. Although they were cordial, there was a certain distance and, on some occasions, a hidden tension. Dona Teresa's arrival changed the dynamics of the household. In addition to needing constant care, she had different habits and a temperament that made living with her more challenging. In the first few days, she began to criticize the way Luisa organized the house, the way she prepared meals, and even small details of the decor. Antonio always liked more home-cooked food, Luisa. This modern food has no flavor, she would comment, subtly teasing Luisa. Antonio, in turn, was always busy with work and left most of the care for his mother to Luisa. As the days went by, the weight of the household chores and the care for Dona Teresa began to overwhelm Luisa, who was already feeling emotionally worn out by the tension with her husband. However, she kept quiet, avoiding arguing or creating more conflicts. But Dona Teresa seemed not to notice Luisa's efforts. Whenever she could, she would make some derogatory comment, criticizing everything from breakfast to the tidiness of the living room. For Luisa, it was like walking through a minefield inside her own house, not knowing when she would hear the next criticism. And Antonio, although he knew about the difficulties, did not seem willing to intervene. When Luisa tried to talk to him, he would only tell her to be patient, that her mother was going through a difficult time, and that they would soon get used to it. The wear and tear was increasing, and Luisa began to feel suffocated. The house, which had always been her refuge and her safe place, now seemed to be slipping away from her. It was no longer the cozy home where she could rest and be herself. Dona Teresa's presence, added to the weight of the conflict with Antonio, made her feel like a stranger in her own home. So, one night when everyone was already in bed, Luisa sat alone in the living room and looked at the stain on the ceiling. She knew that it was not just a matter of repair. That stain was a symbol of the deterioration she felt around her. The love and understanding that had once united her and Antonio seemed to be disappearing, and Dona Teresa's presence only intensified what had previously been just a small crack. She wondered how much longer she could bear it. It was at that moment that she realized that perhaps it was time to rethink her priorities. Luisa knew she needed to find a way to regain her peace, but she didn't know how. And, as she looked up at the ceiling and the house she loved so much, she wondered if it was still possible to restore what had once been so solid between her and Antonio. The days turned into weeks, and Luisa could no longer hide her tiredness. The routine was exhausting, and living with Dona Teresa was becoming increasingly unsustainable. Her mother-in-law seemed not to care about Luisa's efforts to keep her comfortable, and each day new complaints arose. "This house is a mess, Luisa. My house has never been like this," she would say, in a critical tone, as she observed every detail of the organization that Luisa tried to maintain. Antonio, on the other hand, seemed increasingly absent. Work and financial worries took up most of his time, and he simply didn't notice how worn out his wife was. Luisa felt alone amidst the burden of taking care of the house, her mother-in-law, and dealing with the weight of constant criticism. Many nights she found herself in silent tears, feeling invisible in her own home. One morning, already exhausted, Luisa began to feel strangely weak and dizzy all of a sudden, which almost made her lose her balance. Even so, she decided to continue with her tasks, not wanting to worry Antonio, who already seemed distant. Deep down, Luisa felt that, to him, her concerns were irrelevant, and that complaining would only make things worse. However, as the days went by, the dizziness became more frequent, accompanied by a feeling of deep fatigue that would not go away, even when she tried to rest. One night, when she tried to talk to Antonio about how she was feeling, she received a cold and inconsiderate response. "Ah, Luisa, you're exaggerating. It's just tiredness. You need to organize yourself better with my mother and with the things around the house." "I know it's a bit of work, but it's no reason for such drama," he said, as he got up to go to bed, leaving Luisa alone in the living room. Those words, spoken so insensitively, hurt Luisa deeply. She realized that the man she had married and who had always been her support and refuge now seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. The love that had always united them seemed to disappear, dissolving amid criticism, demands, and indifference. In the following days, Luisa continued to face the symptoms, ignoring them as best she could. But inside, she felt that something was wrong. One afternoon, while she was making lunch, a more intense dizziness forced her to sit down quickly to avoid falling. Frightened, she realized that perhaps it was time to see a doctor and see what was really going on. Even though she knew that Antonio could ignore her decision, she didn't tell him about the appointment. She wanted to avoid it. Another cold response. So, alone and with a heavy heart, she went to the doctor's office. During the consultation, the doctor noticed Luisa's tiredness and dejected expression, and after asking a few questions, asked her to undergo some tests. Days later, when she received the results, Luisa was faced with unexpected and devastating news. In a calm voice, the doctor explained that she had a serious health problem, and that from then on she would need constant care and support. His words echoed in her mind as she tried to assimilate the gravity of the situation. For a moment, Luisa thought about how she would tell Antonio this, and a lump formed in her throat. She felt the weight of the diagnosis and the lack of support, knowing that she would need support more than ever. However, deep down, she feared that his response would just be another form of demand or coldness. As she left the doctor's office, Luisa took a deep breath and with tears in her eyes prepared herself to face this new stage, even without knowing if she would have the partner she loved so much by her side. Upon returning from the doctor's office, Luisa felt a mixture of fear and insecurity. She walked slowly through the streets, letting the wind blow on her face as she processed everything she had just heard. The diagnosis was serious, and she knew she would need strength to face the treatment. However, most of her fear came from the uncertainty about Antonio's reaction. Would he finally understand the gravity of the situation and be by her side? When she got home, she found Antonio in the living room, distracted, absorbed in his own thoughts. With a heavy heart, Luisa tried to start the conversation. "Antonio, I need to tell you something important." He glanced at her quickly, but without paying much attention, while he picked up his cell phone to check some notification. "Today I went to the doctor, and he told me that I have a serious problem. I will need treatment and a lot of help to deal with it." The words came out hesitantly, as if each syllable carried the weight of the pain she was trying to share. Antonio, however, seemed little shaken. "Look, Luisa, I understand that you're worried, but I'm also going through a lot at work. We have so many bills to pay. I can't get distracted right now," he replied, looking away. For Luisa, this indifference was like a blow. She expected at the very least a hug, a word of comfort. But all she found was a cold barrier, as if he didn't care about what she was going through. It was painful to realize that the man she shared her life with seemed to no longer have the slightest interest in her well-being. In the days that followed, Luisa began her treatment. Although she tried to disguise her difficulties, her health worsened, and with each session she returned more fragile. Donna Teresa, in turn, continued with her criticisms and complaints, showing no empathy for Luisa's situation. Now, on top of everything else, she's sick? What a mess this house has become, she grumbled out loud, without considering the impact of her words. One night, while Luisa was recovering from yet another session, Antonio came home late and tired. Seeing her lying down, he sighed impatiently. "The house is a mess, Luisa, and there's nothing ready for dinner. You need to try harder. I have my responsibilities too, you know." These words broke something inside Luisa. She looked up at the ceiling, seeing the water stain that had never been fixed, and felt that the pain she was carrying was not just physical. Her suffering seemed invisible to him, who cared only about his own comfort and routine. Worn out and sad, Luisa decided that she could no longer bear to face this situation alone. She needed support, someone who could help her get through this with dignity. It was then that she remembered Clara, her childhood friend, someone she could always trust. Without thinking twice, she picked up the phone and called her, looking for a voice that would bring her comfort. Clara answered immediately, and upon hearing Luisa's trembling voice, she didn't hesitate to offer her support. "Luisa, I'm with you. No matter what you need, I'll be by your side. Don't go through this alone. We'll face it together," Clara said, with a firmness that brought tears of relief to Luisa's eyes. In the days that followed, Clara became a constant presence. She helped Luisa with the housework, with the food, and most importantly, with her emotional well-being. It was a support that she didn't receive from Antonio, but that she now found in her friend. Even with her mother-in-law's criticism and her husband's coldness, Luisa felt a little peace, knowing that at least she had someone by her side. The relationship between Luisa and Clara began to brighten the darkest days. It was a reminder that despite adversity, true love and friendship can arise when least expected. And so, even in the face of illness and loneliness, Luisa began to find the strength to carry on, forward, feeling that she was not completely helpless. As the weeks went by, Clara's presence became the anchor that kept Luisa steady in the midst of the storm. On the days when she felt weakest, Clara was there to hold her hand and remind her that she was not alone. In contrast, Antonio seemed increasingly distant, arriving home late and avoiding talking about the treatment. It was as if he had closed himself off in his own world, oblivious to the battle his wife was facing. The situation worsened when Luisa began to visibly lose weight and strength, something that did not go unnoticed by her mother-in-law. Donna Teresa, however, instead of showing empathy, continued with her inflexible criticisms. "Now, on top of everything else, the food is tasteless. It seems like everything here is just about her illness," she murmured, looking at Luisa with contempt. On a particularly difficult night, Luisa noticed that when she arrived home, Antonio was wearing a perfume on his jacket that was not hers. It was a faint, sweet smell, and her first reaction was to wonder if she was imagining things. However, his increasingly sporadic appearances, accompanied by vague excuses about working extra hours, began to raise suspicions. And Luisa, although worn out by her own condition, could not ignore the possibility that her husband was pulling away even more, or perhaps seeking solace in someone else. Despite the physical and emotional suffering, Luisa knew she had to maintain her dignity. Every time Antonio came home without showing affection or interest in her condition, it was as if another piece of her heart was shattered. She had loved him deeply, and each act of indifference on his part made it even more evident how much their marriage was falling apart. One night, Luisa summoned the courage to try to talk to Antonio about his absences and the distance she felt. "Antonio, I feel like I'm facing everything alone. I need you, your support, someone to hold me when everything seems to be falling apart." He looked at her for a moment but looked away, shaking his head impatiently. "Luisa, I'm already doing what I can. You don't understand how hard work is. We need this money to cover expenses. I just ask that you be understanding." Those cold words cut deeper than any physical pain. Luisa realized that the man who had once been her support now saw her as a burden, not a companion. The loneliness seemed overwhelming, but at the same time she felt an inner strength emerging, a resistance that she perhaps didn't even know she had. After that conversation, Luisa closed herself off even more, keeping her pain and doubts to herself. On her saddest days, it was Clara who visited her, bringing words of affection and encouraging her not to give up. Clara seemed to understand that Luisa's fight went far beyond cancer. It was a fight for her own dignity and for a love that by all indications no longer existed. As she faced the challenges of treatment and Antonio's coldness, Luisa began to look at the future with a different perspective. For the first time, she began to consider the possibility of moving on without him. Little by little, between the tears and the days of recovery with Clara, she realized that she deserved more than a life of indifference. She remained silent, but a decision began to form in her heart, like a timid light that appeared in the distance, showing a path of hope and dignity. It was painful to realize that the love between her and Antonio seemed to have been lost. But at the same time, Luisa felt that this difficult phase was showing her who really cared about her and what was truly worthwhile in life. And even though the decision to move on was a long and difficult path, she began to glimpse a new horizon. Luisa continued her treatment with the same strength that she had cultivated in the last few months. Clara's visits made the process more bearable, and her presence was like a balm for her heart. In contrast, Antonio was increasingly absent, and when he was home, his indifference was visible. Luisa no longer expected a gesture of affection or understanding. She had accepted that, as far as he was concerned, she would continue this battle alone. It was during one of Clara's visits that a new chapter began to unfold in Luisa's life. The house needed some repairs, and Clara insisted that she let a bricklayer take care of them. Initially reluctant, Luisa ended up accepting, and Clara quickly contacted an acquaintance named Miguel, a calm-spoken man with a look that conveyed kindness and simplicity. Miguel arrived accompanied by his young son, Pedro, a shy and curious boy with a smile who quickly became attached to Luisa. While Miguel worked on the repairs, Pedro stayed nearby, talking to Luisa and asking innocent questions about everything around him. The boy's presence. He brought a little light to Luisa's routine, who could no longer remember the last time she had heard laughter in that house. Pedro, with his sweet and spontaneous manner, soon became an unexpected companion, while Miguel, focused and dedicated to his work, impressed Luisa with his respect and attention to detail. Over the course of her workdays, Luisa got to know a little more about Miguel. He was a single father, struggling to raise Pedro alone, and he faced difficulties with serenity and courage. The way he cared for his son, the way he talked about his life, and the respect he showed in every gesture towards Luisa made her see something special in him. Miguel seemed to understand, without the need for words, what it meant to face challenges with dignity and strength. Between breaks, Luisa and Miguel talked about life, about overcoming obstacles, and about what really mattered. She realized that there was a kindness in Miguel that she no longer found in Antonio, and this contrast made her reflect on her choices and on what she deserved to experience from then on. Miguel and Pedro's presence brought Luisa joy, something she hadn't felt in a long time. During one of those conversations, Miguel looked at her sincerely and said, "Luisa, I don't know exactly what you're going through, but I can see that you're a strong person. My son and I are here for whatever you need." These words, spoken so simply and directly, touched Luisa deeply, and she felt that someone was finally seeing her pain and recognizing her as a person, not just as someone who was sick. The repairs to the house progressed, and Miguel made each space more welcoming, fixing not only the leaky roof, but in a way, also the small pieces of Luisa's heart, who felt more valued every day. Little by little, she realized that Miguel was filling a space in her life, something she had never imagined finding again. As Miguel finished the work, Luisa found herself thinking about how those days with him and little Pedro had shown her a new perspective, a ray of hope. Their presence was a reminder that life could be lighter, more respectful, and full of meaning, even in the midst of challenges. When they said goodbye, Miguel promised to come back to help her whenever she needed it, and made it clear that both he and Pedro would miss her. Luisa, moved, thanked him deeply, feeling that there, in that gesture, was a sincere friendship and a new possibility of happiness. When Miguel and Pedro left, Luisa stared at the ceiling, now without leaks, reflecting on the changes that had been happening in her life. Perhaps finally she had found a new reason to move on and, who knows, a new beginning. With Miguel and Pedro gone, Luisa felt the silence of the house in a different way. Now, that home did not only carry sad memories and memories of pain, There were also moments of affection and laughter with Pedro, and the caring presence of Miguel. The days they spent together had made her see that life could have more meaning and that she deserved a full existence, surrounded by respect and genuine love. Weeks passed, and Clara continued to visit Luisa regularly. She noticed the renewed sparkle in her friend's eyes and, smiling, encouraged her to continue searching for her own happiness. One sunny afternoon, Clara suggested that Luisa go out for a while, go to a nearby park, or have a coffee. "You need to open yourself up to the world, Luisa. Who knows what life has in store for you?" Clara said hopefully. It was that same afternoon that Luisa, now feeling more energetic, decided to go out and take a walk. The fresh air gave her a feeling of freedom, something she hadn't felt in a long time. In the middle of the walk, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. It was Miguel, who was with Pedro, enjoying the sunny day in the park. Pedro, upon seeing her, ran towards her, smiling and talking about how much he missed the stories Luisa told while he accompanied her in the repairs to the house. Miguel, smiling kindly, invited her to sit with them and share the snack they had brought. During the conversation, Miguel spoke sincerely about the challenges of raising Pedro alone, about the daily struggle and sacrifices he made. He did not speak with self-pity, but with a serenity that Luisa admired. He was a man who faced his difficulties with dignity, exactly what she felt was missing in her relationship with Antonio. Luisa, in turn, opened her heart and spoke a little about her own struggle. She told him about her illness, about the loneliness she felt at home, and the lack of support from Antonio. Miguel listened to her attentively without judgment, and responded with a tenderness that she did not expect. "You are a very strong woman, Luisa. You should not carry this alone. We all need someone to walk by our side." The words were like a hug to Luisa's heart, and she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. With Miguel, there was no pressure, only understanding and respect. As she looked at Pedro, who was now playing by her side, Luisa felt a genuine affection for that boy who, without meaning to, had brought so much relief to her most difficult days. At the end of the afternoon, when they said goodbye, Miguel looked her in the eyes and, with disarming sincerity, said, "Luisa, I don't know what the future holds for us, but know that you have a friend here. I will be here for you, whenever you need me." These words echoed in her mind during the drive back home, filling her with a feeling of welcome that she hadn't experienced in a long time. When she returned, Luisa found Antonio at home, distracted as always, not asking where she had been or how she felt. She realized clearly that their relationship had become just a facade. Antonio was no longer a real part of her life. He was just a shadow, while she gradually discovered a path of light and new possibilities. For the first time, Luisa began to imagine a life without Antonio, a future in which she would not need to beg for affection or understanding, a future where she could be valued for who she really was. And in that future, perhaps there would be room for new friendships, new stories, and who knows, a new love that would timidly emerge in her heart. With this realization, Luisa felt stronger and ready to face whatever came. She was no longer the same woman who waited for the approval and affection of an absent husband. She was a woman who recognized her worth and who finally allowed herself to dream of a happier and fuller life. The days of reflection made Luisa realize that she needed to make a decision. She could no longer bear the loneliness next to someone who saw her as a burden and not as a partner. With Clara's support, she organized her thoughts and decided that it was time to confront Antonio and free herself from that marriage that, for so long, had only brought her sadness and frustration. One night when Antonio arrived home, Luisa was waiting for him in the living room. Sitting down, with a calm but determined expression, she looked him straight in the eye and said bluntly, "Antonio, we need to talk. I can no longer live next to someone who treats me coldly and indifferently. I deserve more than this." Antonio, surprised, tried to argue, claiming that she was exaggerating, that his responsibilities at work demanded too much, but Luisa interrupted him. It's not about work, Antonio. It's about the lack of respect, the lack of affection, and the abandonment you showed when I needed it most. We are no longer married. We are just strangers living in the same house." She felt the firmness in each word and realized there was no going back. Antonio, frustrated, grumbled and left, as if he could not accept reality. Without losing her composure, Luisa stood up, feeling a new lightness, a freedom she had not felt in years. And that very night, she made the decision to leave that chapter behind. The next day, with Clara's help, Luisa began to organize the house. She decided to sell the property, but this time for a different reason. Not to fulfill Antonio's wishes, but to start her life over in a new place, free from the shadows of the past. The news of the sale attracted interested parties, and among them Miguel stood out. He knew how much that house meant to Luisa, and offered to help her with whatever she needed. It was then that, on a sunny afternoon, Luisa and Miguel sat at the kitchen table, where everything was beginning to change. He looked at her, with the same affection and respect that he always showed, and in a soft voice asked, "Luisa, have you ever thought about starting over in a place where you feel truly valued?" She smiled, knowing that those words carried something deeper. "Yes, Miguel, and I think that this place is not just a new house. I think it is a new life, perhaps next to someone who really cares." Miguel held her hand, and without another word, they both knew they had found a new chance, a life where respect and affection would be the basis of everything. That was the first step towards a genuine love, and a partnership that Luisa never imagined she would experience. Months later, Luisa and Miguel, along with little Pedro, found a new home. She discovered that true love did not need to be begged for or demanded. It showed itself in small gestures, in companionship, and in the sincere presence of those who choose to stay. And so, alongside Miguel and Pedro, Luisa began a new chapter, full of hope and happiness. Finally, life smiled at her again, and she knew she was exactly where she should be, at peace, in a home built with love and respect.